listening to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am joined by my co-hosts, Jen Kling and Bob Villier. And today we are talking about nostalgia. But as usual, we are going to get some drink orders and put some tunes on the jukebox. Bob, what are you drinking and what do you want to play today?
Well, I think I'm going to have a theme-appropriate drink. I'd like an old-fashioned. And for the jukebox choice, I have selected a song from The Smiths called The Old House.
I would rather not go back to the old house. There's too many bad memories.
Morrissey would rather not go back there because he's a whiny little bitch. If you listen to the lyrics, he's just complaining that, oh, I liked you and you didn't know, boo-hoo. But there is a melancholic nostalgia in the song about you can't return home no matter how much you want to. You might like to, but you just can't. And that kind of goes to the heart of nostalgia.
Jen, what about you?
I'm going to have a hot toddy. I'm feeling just a little bit under the weather, so I think something nice and cozy for my throat. And my song today is Warren Zevon's one-hit wonder, Werewolves of London.
I saw a werewolf with a Chinese menu in his hand, walking through the streets of Soho in the rain. He was looking for the place called Lee Ho Fooks. Gonna get a big dish of beef chow mein. Werewolves of London.
The reason I picked this song is because the whole song is really a reference list of different places in England. And as I was thinking about our episode theme this week, I started getting nostalgic for the time that I spent traveling through England, seeing all the sights, going to Mayfair, going to Kent. And the song really speaks to this imagined England. And so it really just made me think of that. Lee, how about you?
Well, I'm also going to try to stick to the theme today. And for a drink, I am going to have a Southern Comfort in Diet Coke. So Southern Comfort was my drink of my college years, unfortunately. And I would like to revisit those. And my song choice is also a personally nostalgic song. I'm choosing James Taylor's Fire and Rain.
I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end. I've seen lonely times when I could not find a friend. But I always thought that I'd see you again.
So the story behind this is that when I was a young child, my father used to drive me to school, and he had one of those old 8-track players in his car, and he only had 3 8-tracks, and one of them was Neil Diamond, one of them was James Taylor, and one of them was Paul Simon. So I feel like I know all the words to all 3 of those artists' songs. But Fire and Rain itself is a kind of nostalgic song. He's telling this story about a terrible accident in which one of his friends, I think it might have been one of his former lovers or wives, died in a plane crash. And he says, I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end. But what I didn't think was that I would never see you again. And I think that really gets to kind of the sadness of nostalgia, that we sort of remember back not only to the memories that we hold dear, but also to a time when we thought that those memories would always persist. So on that deep thought, Bob, this was your topic. Do you want to set the conversation up for us?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I've been nostalgic a lot recently, mostly because I'm old and decrepit. But it's gotten me thinking about nostalgia quite a bit as a phenomenon. And I did a little bit of reading about it. It's a portmanteau as a word, coined in 1688 by Johannes Hofer. And it combines the Greek nostros, which means homecoming, and algos, which means pain or ache. An aspirin is an analgesic, right? It's against pain. Now, Hofer was a Swiss medical student, so he invented this term to describe a kind of melancholia, a somewhat depressive state. So from its very beginning, nostalgia was viewed as a mood disorder. It was medicalized. And especially for the Romantics, it was a sentimentality for the past, the good old days of yore, combining the sadness of loss with a joy that that loss is not complete or total. Mm-hmm. And it's also paradoxical because the past we long for and that we remember is a past that was never present. So if it is a homecoming, what one discovers in returning home, as Odysseus does, and maybe the Odyssey is the first literary tale of nostalgia, what he discovers is that there's no there. The home that he was hoping to go to is no longer what he finds. So nostalgia is always unheimlich, unhomely, or more accurately, uncanny. It always involves self-deception about what was. It distorts or idealizes the past, and this can often have negative and even dangerous consequences individually, socially, and politically. Thinking about nostalgia takes us into the realm of memory, the knowability of time, as well as the hermeneutics of personal identity and even reality itself. So it's more than just a mood. It's a vector of philosophical investigation par excellence that opens onto a wide range of themes. So let's explore some of them on this week's episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. Well, let's get started by trying to wrap our heads around what nostalgia entails, at least in philosophy, because it cuts across and means different things in academic disciplines. Some key philosophical themes and concepts that one might associate with nostalgia include homesickness, time and temporality, affectivity and well-being, autobiography, and memory. And there's probably also metaphysics, topography, and yes, Lee, even a hauntology of nostalgia that we can talk about.
I'm going to need some help with that term. So one thing I immediately thought of, Bob, when you raised this topic as a possibility was whether you can be nostalgic for something you didn't yourself experience. So I was an English major in undergrad, and we were all deeply in love with the Victorian era, mostly because we read the literature of that era. And I found myself trying to figure out if I could be nostalgic for the Victorian era, even though I wasn't there. And so I'm wondering if nostalgia has something to do with your experiences, or whether you can be nostalgic for something you've never experienced.
There was a recent New York Times article talking about how Gen Z is really nostalgic for the 80s, which of course they never experienced. And so I absolutely agree that there is this phenomenon. I mean, how to explain it, I'm not entirely sure, but there is this phenomenon. I had a meeting with a student actually a couple of years ago where she was sort of relating to me in very specific details her nostalgia for the 80s. I mean, she was talking about Walkmans and paper phone books, things that has never been a part of her life. And she was born in like 2002. So, I mean, it's very interesting how this feeling can get attached to memories that aren't even your, like, quote unquote, real memories.
Mm-hmm.
I think that actually kind of gets to the heart of some aspect of nostalgia. Yes, on a personal level, it's a nostalgia for something that you experienced, the good old days, of the halcyon days of your misspent youth or whatever. But on a bigger level, nostalgia has always been about something distant in the past. For the German Romantics, it was about ancient Greece. Mm-hmm. And, for the Germans in general, throughout the 19th century, there was kind of an obsession with ancient Greece. So it is, I think, entirely part of the phenomenon of nostalgia that it is trans-temporal in some way. And just as a little side note, you remember when we were kids, well, you and me, Lee, maybe not you, Jen, there was a TV show called Happy Days.
Oh, yeah.
Which is where we get the phrase, jump the shark. Now, Happy Days was on in the 1970s, and it was nostalgic for the 1950s.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
20 years ago. And when I was a kid watching that show, that just seemed so distant in the past, the 1950s. If the 25-year rule applied, they say you get nostalgic for things 25 years ago, then Happy Days were remade today, we would be celebrating the year 2000.
Yikes.
Oh my gosh, I can't even with
Shut
that.
your mouth.
But I do think what's interesting about nostalgia is that while it is celebrating the past in a sense, it's not a desire to actually go back to the past. I have seen reruns of Happy Days. Full disclosure, I didn't see it when it originally came out, but I have seen reruns. And while it looks lovely, I do always have this moment of thinking, I don't actually want to go back to the 1950s because I'm a woman and the 1950s were not awesome. And so I don't actually want to go back there. Nonetheless, I sort of like dreaming about it. And so I wonder if we can think of nostalgia as not only a mood, but sort of a not fully formed desire, because it's not about wanting to actually go back. It strikes me. It's about just wanting to dream, maybe?
Yes, I think this is at the very heart of what the Germans understood by nostalgia. They had this word for it, and it appears particularly often in Schelling. This word is Sehnsucht, which is a kind of languid desire, a kind of longing for a past that was never present, perhaps, or for a past that you never experienced or cannot attain in any way, but a longing nonetheless. So there was both a little bit of pain in that longing for something lost, but also a kind of idealization of what was lost. And maybe it's that idealizing function that you're thinking of when you say you like to dream about these kinds of things, but you wouldn't actually like to go there.
I think that idealizing function is a really important aspect of nostalgia, and it helps us get at the rather complicated relationship between nostalgia and memory. Because I think often people think that what nostalgia activates is a kind of connection to certain memories, and that those memories are accurate accounts of things that happened in the past. And of course, our memories are themselves imaginations. Our memories are themselves constructions. And what we remember was never fully present as we remember it. And so, nostalgia in this sense is idealizing memories, but that's not to say that memories aren't themselves idealizations.
And what happens when you idealize a memory as well? I mean, you latch on to all the good bits. You forget the bad bits. You exclude them from that account of your past or that account of yourself, maybe because they're hurtful, maybe because they embarrass you, or whatever reasons. But there is a kind of selecting function that happens in idealization as well.
But I don't think nostalgia is just a form of idealized memory. I agree, memory is always reconstructed. It's never veridical. But I guess I always think of nostalgia as not only this idealization, but also a calling back to who I was at the time I experienced the thing I'm nostalgizing. I don't know if you can make a verb out of nostalgia, but I just did. So when I think about being nostalgic for the Victorian era, part of what I'm doing, I think, is remembering what it was like to be a college student, discovering all of these ideas and images for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's not just idealizing memory. I think there's something else going on too. It's a calling back to a previous self.
Probably the most famous example of nostalgia is the Proustian Madeleine from Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And basically, the narrator, who's unnamed, but I'll call him Marcel because it is Proust. At any rate, he eats a Madeleine, and in eating the Madeleine, he says, he's kind of flooded with these memories, like someone's just opened the dam of memories. And he recalls being a young child and visiting his aunt, and these sunny afternoons where he would have lunch with her and she would serve Madeleines. And I think that is very consistent with what you were just describing, Jen, that he is recalling a past version of himself, but also a world that is literally corporeally, physically associated with all of these feelings and these smells and these tastes, people, these ghosts like of his aunt. There's just so much that's unleashed in nostalgia that I don't think is directly about ourselves necessarily, or a particular moment in time or a particular situation. I think it's really a kind of holistic experience that both inspires in us a feeling of fondness, but also a pain, a longing, as Bob was describing earlier.
A longing for a simpler time, but also, part of Proust's story there is when he cracks open the Madeleine and all these memories come flooding back, he feels compelled to recount them all, to record them all in almost excruciating detail. So we learn about the smell of the Madeleine, the smell of his grandmother's house, the town that she lived in, the streets, the neighbors, every possible thing you can think of. He feels compelled to record all of this because it is part of himself. And so the recherche is really an attempt to record who Marcel Proust is. And in order to do that accurately, he has to engage in this incredibly descriptive, minutious exercise. And at the end of the story, the very end, nobody's ever read all 8 volumes, I suppose, but I have.
Humble brag.
He's back in the present moment, and the message is, go outside, Marcel. You've spent all of this time committing to paper what your memory is remembering, but now you got to go out and live a little bit. Get out of the past and go be part of the present.
As the kids say, go touch some grass.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Well, we used to say that in the 80s too, but we meant something different.
Everything past is new again. So this raises a question for me about whether nostalgia is about the person having the nostalgia or the experience being nostalgized. You pointed out that Marcel is recording himself in a way, but he doesn't seem to be. He seems to be recording a past version of himself, which of course I suppose makes up his own identity. But I guess I'm wondering what differentiates nostalgia from something like daydreaming, whether it's about the person or about the experience, or is it some mixture of both?
One real quick point is the reason that it's 8 volumes long is because he has to record every epic of his life. So he's not the same character in every one of the, he's the same character, but he's not the same. So he's recording the evolution of himself over time as well.
Yeah, and not to be annoyingly Derridian, but I am going to be right now, because I think what you're getting at is what Derrida would call a hauntology. One of the things that's really interesting about memory, and especially about nostalgia, and may also be true about daydreaming, I haven't thought that through yet, is that it's trying to grasp something that is neither present nor absent. It's there in the form of memory, but it's not there in the form of a real metaphysical presence. And it's more like a ghost. And so when we try to grab onto these things, as Marcel does in his endless articulation or recording of these memories, we can't grab onto them. It's like trying to grab onto a cloud or mist. They're neither there nor not there. And there is a kind of logic to that. And I think that's what Derrida means when he talks about a hauntology, that there is a logic to things that are neither present nor absent, and at the same time, both present and absent. And it's not the logic of traditional metaphysics of presence.
But it does seem to be deeply wrapped up with identity in an interesting way. And so could you talk a little more for me, asking for a friend, about how this idea of hauntology and identity are wrapped up together? Because I think that's been an underlying thread so far about how nostalgia and identity go together.
I'm not sure that I would say that hauntology and identity are wrapped up together only for this reason, that identity is itself a category that is central to what Derrida would call the metaphysics of presence. Like, identity literally means like something is the same as itself, right? It's fully present. It's identical. What I could say is the relationship between memory and identity, because there's a long philosophical tradition that points to memory as kind of how we maintain identity over time, trans-temporal identity. This is like famously articulated in, several thought experiments in the past. The most famous probably being I think it was called the Brave Officer. I don't remember who posed this.
Yeah, it's from John Locke.
I don't think it's Locke who actually came up with it. Locke borrowed it, I believe.
Ah, that's John Locke. He borrows everything and then claims it as his own.
Yeah, but at any rate, the idea is that, there's this soldier, right, who goes into the army, and later he becomes a lieutenant and he has some kind of a brain injury, and then he becomes a general, and the general can remember who he was as a lieutenant but can't remember who he was as a boy. And the lieutenant can remember who he was as a boy, but of course doesn't yet know himself as a general. The question basically is like, are all these three people the same people? Are they identical? How do we say that this identity expands over time when there are these breaks in memories? And, there are lots of different ways to answer this, but a lot of people do point to memory as being absolutely essential to maintaining identity. Now, what's interesting about nostalgia, I think, is that nostalgia tries to grab at memory and kind of anchor it in a present identity. But here's where the hauntology comes in, because you can't grab that memory. That memory is both present and absent, as is the identity associated with it.
But just the very fact of engaging in some nostalgic reflection is important for maintaining the myth of the self in one way or another, right? If you're not able to do that, just like in this thought experiment, if you're not able to narrate your history, then it is questionable if you are the same person. And this is especially important for Alzheimer's patients, for example. If they're unable to connect to past experiences, then they don't know who they are in the present, and then that's very frustrating for them. So one aspect of working with Alzheimer's patients is to allow them and to aid them in engaging in nostalgia, helping them recover past memories, if even only for a fleeting moment, so that they do have a sense of identity.
So would we call nostalgia a subset of memory then? I think this is my analytic training coming out. I'm trying to classify it, which is why I'm asking all of these questions about how is nostalgia related to identity? How is it related to memory? How is it related to the past? So could we say that nostalgia is a subset of memory, as in not all memory is nostalgic, but all nostalgia is memory of a kind?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that nostalgia is an affect. It's also maybe an activity, but it is not a subset of memory. I mean, memory is one of the aspects that trigger, I guess you could say, nostalgia, but so do tastes, so do smells, so do the feel of things. I mean, like I've had the experience, for example, where I've met my friend's dog and I've petted the dog. The feel of the fur reminded me of my first dog, gave me that sort of same nostalgic opening of the gates of memory, but it's separate from memory. It's something entirely different, I think.
Hey there, dear listeners. Everybody agrees that the best time of the conference is after the conference is over and we're all hanging out in the bar having discussions. It's our social hour. And speaking of being social, you should be following us on social media. You can find us on Blue Sky, YouTube, and Facebook. And in all three of those places, we're at Hotel Bar Sessions. So please follow us on social media and keep the social hour going.
So we've been talking all about nostalgia, and I feel like in some ways I'm getting a better grip on when it's happening, but I'm losing the thread of what it actually is. It's starting to feel like pornography to me. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Whatever Proust was doing, it's nostalgia. Whatever I'm doing when I think back to my experience of seeing Star Wars when I'm 8, that's nostalgia. But I feel like I'm still not clear on what it actually is. Can someone help me out?
Well, I mean, not to be a broken record here, but it actually isn't anything. There is no what it actually is. Yeah, I mean, the thing about nostalgia is that, again, it's neither present nor absent. And so we can't say what it is in the way that we could say what, a table is or a chair is, just to use the most obvious examples in all of philosophy.
Try a different approach, maybe. There's a French philosopher who talked a lot about the absurdity and meaninglessness of the world and how we're always striving to find unity and coherence or reason and purpose. And he calls this perpetual striving nostalgia. This is Albert Camus.
Mm-hmm.
So for Camus, nostalgia is this sort of striving after a unity or coherence to the experience that we have of life, But that striving is never going to be satisfied. It's like a defense against the dark arts that's always doomed to fail. We're never going to find what we're looking for or what we desire. So there really is no there.
So I think I'm getting a grip on nostalgia as an activity rather than a object, we might say. But then as an activity, it strikes me that there have to be some outlines of the activity so that we can recognize it as the activity it is. For instance, what's the difference between nostalgia and memorialization?
Well, like Lee, I was hesitant to say that nostalgia is a subset of memory, but it certainly runs alongside memory. It is a phenomenon, nostalgia, and so it is susceptible to a phenomenological reading. And, part of that reading would involve distinguishing it from mere acts of memory because there is affect involved.
Can I ask a question for a friend?
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about what phenomenology is? Because when you said nostalgia is a phenomenon, my immediate snarky response was going to be, yes, everything is a phenomenon. It doesn't make clear to me why it's amenable to a phenomenological reading in particular.
So phenomenology is a way of doing philosophy invented in the early 20th century by this German named Edmund Husserl. And it had several adherents, French and German mostly, but European, and eventually made its way to America. The most famous adherents of phenomenology are probably Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Emmanuel Levinas. They all have different styles of doing phenomenology, different sort of concerns within phenomenology, but they all share maybe what could be called the phenomenological imperative, which is, first of all, to go back to the thing itself and let it speak on its own terms, has to speak from out of itself, by itself, as it were. And that means not applying any sort of prefabricated framework to it or other discursive framework to it. As a result, they invented, the phenomenologists, a lot of words to talk about these different phenomena. So for Husserl, it's always an act of the mind. An act of the mind can be described in different ways. Memory is an act of the mind. Surprise is an act of the mind. Nostalgia is an act of the mind, etc. And so each one of those different acts would have a different but related vocabulary associated with it.
I would like to go back to an older understanding of phenomenon from Kant, where Kant distinguishes the phenomenon from the noumenon. So the phenomenon is things as they appear to consciousness, noumenon as things as they are in themselves. And of course, Kant famously gives us kind of hand-waving explanation of noumena, saying, well, we can't know what they are because they don't appear to consciousness, right? We can't know what a thing is in itself, independent of consciousness, because we are a consciousness. But the interesting thing about that definition of phenomena as things as they appear to us might give us a kind of lever on understanding what nostalgia is, because nostalgia is the appearance in a way of things, first of all, unbidden, right? Like you can't make yourself be nostalgic. So I might want to even draw back my earlier explanation of nostalgia as an activity, because I don't think that I can do nostalgia. Nostalgic is something that happens to me. It kind of appears unbidden. But as it appears, involves all of these things that are themselves not present, not fully present anyway. They're emotions, affects, memories, so it's a kind of double ghostliness to it, both in its origin, in its source, in its cause, and in its actual phenomenon.
I was going to say, Jen, your question actually that started all of this was, what's the difference between nostalgia and memorialization? So let's go back to that for a second and take maybe an oblique approach or use a different opposition to get at the crux of it. On the one hand, the work of autobiography is a kind of nostalgic mythology of the self. And there are some famous autobiographies in the history of philosophy. Rousseau's Confessions is actually hilarious nighttime reading. Scenes of him masturbating in a boat and whatnot, just great stuff. Augustine has some confessions as well, and his mother, Monica, his mamica, features pretty heavily in there. And, you kind of got to wonder, is any of this true when he's talking about some of these things? Nietzsche's autobiography is certainly not true. I mean, the chapter titles are Why I Am So Great and Why I Am So Wise. And Derrida has Circumfessions as well. So, autobiography is a kind of nostalgic mythology of the self. But then we have this other activity, you called it memorialization. I might call it hagiography. Post-death nostalgia is a hagiography. And we can contrast two recent cases. Dick Cheney just died a couple of days ago. And all sorts of glowing articles came out about him. He was a statesman. He did what he believed in. Nobody mentioned that he was a war criminal. Nobody mentioned that he lied about Iraq or anything like that. It was all just sort of celebrating the death of this so-called great man. So a lot of work was done there in those hagiographies to strip away the bad parts and preserve only a good part and give us a warm, glowy feeling about Dick Cheney, which was easy to have because another contrast that was going on there was, in light of the present situation, he wasn't really so bad. Compared to what we got going on now, he wasn't really so bad, right? And that's kind of a nostalgic function as well. Contrast that hagiography with another one, Charlie Kirk, right? After he was assassinated, there was this huge effort to enshrine him as a saint. Some of that, I think, comes out of René Girard because the ultra-right wing is really into that. But to enshrine him as a saint, and, if anybody said anything critical of him at all, they were stripped, drawn, and quartered. So the memorialization function is a kind of nostalgia that we put on other people after they die. And it's not always a good thing.
I really like this connection to hagiographies. And just for listeners, if you don't know what a hagiography is, it's just the telling of the story of a saint. And I think that there is something sanctifying at work in nostalgia, that we sort of make the thing for which we are nostalgic rosier and prettier and more attractive and more sanctified than it probably was at the moment. And that's exactly why we have this feeling of homesickness, this feeling of longing, this feeling of wanting to return. But that, of course, is an act of the imagination. Now, I'm undoing my previous undo and saying that in that sense, nostalgia, there is an activity to it. There's an imaginative activity to it. I don't think that's how we experience nostalgia, as an act of imagination, whereas I do think that we experience, for example, as you said earlier, Jen, daydreaming as an act of imagination. I think nostalgia happens to us in a way that is... So now I'm undoing the undo of my undo and going back to saying that it's not actually an activity.
It's a very complicated philosophical activity that you're engaging in, Lee.
You'll notice how my argument is both present and absent.
Absolutely crushing it. I'm struggling a little bit then, because now it seems like we're doing two things at the same time. The first thing is we're acknowledging that in some sense, all memory is made up. That's just the nature of memory. And memorialization, Bob, as you helpfully pointed out, very often, if not almost always, has this aspect of sanctifying, of making people seem better than they were in their actual lives. It strikes me, though, that sanctifying isn't the same as nostalgia, because what I'm drawing from this discussion so far is that nostalgia is always bittersweet. And what you don't see in the memorializations of Dick Cheney or Charlie Kirk is a kind of bittersweetness. That strikes me as more of a thing that has to be connected to our own personal experiences. So I wonder if we can distinguish between this idea that memory is always non-veridical, it's always a phenomena in the Kantian sense, it appears to us, not as it is, versus something like nostalgia, which is always going to have sort of a hook of some kind in our affect.
Well, I would just respectfully disagree that the hagiographies or the memorializations of Cheney and Kirk are not bittersweet. I think for the people who are nostalgically remembering Charlie Kirk and Dick Cheney, they absolutely are bittersweet. The bitterness is that they're gone, and the sweetness is the sanctification of them, or the sanctification of the memory of them. And so to be nostalgic for, the glory days of the Cheney-Bush era, or to be nostalgic for the glory days of the Turning Point, quote unquote, debates, is a kind of bittersweetness that is felt by the person who is overwhelmed with nostalgia for those events and that time and those people in particular.
And just as Marcel Proust distorts himself in his story, we distort history in these retellings of it after somebody dies.
So that's really helpful. I think you both just put your finger on the thing that I've been struggling with, which is that nostalgia is for a time. Nostalgia is for those days, right? Those glory days. Dick Cheney was part of that, but he's not the epitome of those glory days, surely.
I think in this instance, it's for a time, but I don't think it's only for a time. I think it could be for a person. I think it could be for a dog. I think it could be for a cookie, like the taste of a cookie.
That's fair.
It's interesting that, for example, smell is the
great trigger.
The sensation that triggers memory more than anything else. And I don't think that when I smell something that reminds me of my grandmother or reminds me of my high school gym, I don't think that I'm nostalgic for a time. I think that I'm nostalgic for a place or a person or a thing.
It's a whole thickness of experience.
Yeah.
The smell that does it for me is the smell of the Paris metro, which I know sounds odd. I'm not talking about the piss smell. It does have its own distinct smell, independent of human urine or whatever. But I know that I'm back in Paris when I smell the metro smell, and I get this whole flood of memories as soon as I smell it. About my life in Paris, my first adventure in Paris. It's not just about a time, it's a whole thickness of experience that comes rushing back at me.
I have this secret belief that all school stairwells smell the same. Like it doesn't matter if it's an elementary school or a high school or a university or a college, and that they somehow smell different than other stairwells. But every now and then I'm in a stairwell in a building that is not a school, and I think, oh, this smells like a school. It's very weird.
But, one thing I think we're sort of getting at here a little bit with this notion of hagiography is the sort of dark side of nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dick Cheney doesn't seem so bad in death now precisely because of the present situation. And, maybe if the present situation were different, if Kamala had won the presidency instead, the view of Dick Cheney's dying would have been vastly different. But there is a sort of dark function, a sort of utopianizing function to nostalgia that simultaneously distorts the past in order to extract us from the present, to save us from the present, to make it seem less bad than it is.
Okay, so maybe Hotel Bar Sessions podcast is not NPR, but like NPR, we are also not receiving public funds anymore. Actually, we never received public funds. We have always been supported by you, our listeners. And to keep this podcast going and to keep our bar tabs open, we need your help. So please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and sign up to be one of our regular supporters. If that's a little bit too much of a commitment for you, no worries. We've also got options for one-time donations that you can make through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App on our website. Just click on the Support Us tab at hotelbarpodcast.com. Every little bit that you can contribute helps defray the costs of what we do here and helps keep our Hotel Bar Sessions tab open and your Hotel Bar Sessions episodes flowing. Thanks in advance. We really appreciate your support. And now, back to the conversation. I want to pick up on that point that Bob left us with at the end of the previous segment, because I think it really points to something that I think is woefully under-theorized about nostalgia, namely that nostalgia is activated partially because there's something missing in our present life, partially because there's a kind of unhappiness, there's a kind of longing for something else, and sometimes we go backwards and say, oh, but if it were just like the good old days, then I wouldn't feel this absence in my soul. sometimes we go forwards in a more utopian, imaginative, constructive sense and say, oh, but if the world were different, I wouldn't feel this absence in my soul. But there is something about nostalgia that's getting at the heart of something deeply, deeply, existentially, fundamentally human, which is that we never feel totally complete.
But I wonder if this is a malaise of the present moment or if this is genuinely part of the human condition.
I think the latter.
I think the latter, too.
Yeah, so I'm reminded of this movie, Midnight in Paris, which is a Woody Allen film. In the film, Owen Wilson is walking through Paris, and he stumbles into the 1920s through sort of a dream sequence. And he's nostalgic for the 1920s, which is why his character goes back to the 1920s. But then in the 20s, he meets a bunch of characters who are themselves nostalgic for La Belle Époque, the turn of the century. And so I'm wondering if, Lee, you're identifying something about our present day, or if it's always the case that we're looking back to the past. This just takes us right back to Proust.
I don't think that it's always the case that we're looking back to the past, but I think it's always the case that we are driven forward, like quite literally motivated to continue living because there's something incomplete about our life. There's something about our life that needs something that we want, that we long for, or that we miss. It could be, in either direction temporally, but I do think that it is fundamentally a part of the human experience to not feel complete, to feel like there's something missing, there's something undone, there's something lost.
Yeah, that's precisely Camus' point.
Yes.
And that's why we have to imagine Sisyphus happy, ultimately.
Yeah.
Right? Is because it does suck, it's absurd, it's meaninglessness, but we have to have some sort of theme or thematic or narrative or whatever to make it all make sense. And if we have to just tell ourselves a lie like, oh yeah, he's happy, then that's what we have to do.
There's a difference between something being lost that we're striving to reclaim versus something being undone. And I worry that when we smush these two things together, we lose the unique political danger of nostalgia. So Make America Great Again is nostalgic versus we could have a future that doesn't depend on disaster capitalism is something undone. But it's not nostalgic.
I totally agree. I think that there are very dangerous elements to nostalgia, just like, in every other phenomenon of being stuck in the past or what was. I think it's just dangerous in general as the kind of species that we are to not be forward looking. But there is something that we can't help about nostalgia. I do think that it's something that happens to us, to the extent that we can be attentive to these sharper edges of it, we should be. But I don't think that we can avoid it. I don't think that we can eliminate it.
Right. Well, as an individual or an existential mood, yes, it's something that befalls us. We find ourselves caught up in a nostalgic mood from time to time. That's one thing. But there is this risk that it does become a political program. Make America great again. When? When exactly was it great? When? According to whom? Right? There's lots of questions involved in there. Those partisans of that particular phrase think it's the 1950s, it's the Mad Men epic, when men were men and sheep were afraid or whatever. But the dangerous social and political consequence of encoding a nostalgic vision of the past as a political program is really problematic. And there's two sort of very heterodox, I'll call them writers, who offer different critiques of modernity. Heidegger, on the one hand, he's got a real problem with technology. He's got a question concerning technology, and he's very worried about the inframing of technology. And it's happening right now with AI, right? And then put next to him someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, who nobody would accuse of being a philosopher, but his vision of the world, of the Shire, defending the West against the evil Lord Sauron, is a desire to preserve a kind of simple, traditional country life against the ravages of modernity. And he's writing this in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So there's a lot going on then that he's worried about. But this idea of producing a simpler, more innocent version of a time gone by when things were simpler, everybody was happy because things were simpler, is requisite for conservatism, for Trumpism, for white supremacy, for heteronormativity, for colonialism, and for this, tradwife movement that's going on right now.
Yeah, I do agree with you that there is something fundamentally conservative about nostalgia, in as much as it involves a kind of fondness for the pastoral, the age of innocence, the simpler times, whatever it is, something that feels like home. But I think that there are two different ways to kind of treat this symptom, we'll say, of nostalgia. One is to wag my finger at people and say, oh, but that really wasn't like that. It really wasn't a simpler time. It really wasn't a better time. It isn't a home that you should want to return to. That's one way. The other way is to say, what is it about your life that's lacking something that is making you fond for this imagined past or this imagined person or this imagined home? And that's, I think, something that we don't do often enough on the left is to say, look, people who are imagining the 50s as the time when America was great are clearly missing something in America now that is causing them pain, they feel is lacking, and that they are replacing with this kind of nostalgic hagiography of the past. Why don't we address that? Like, what's missing? What's lost?
Part of it is a lack of imagination of being able to project a future or future possibilities, like Jen said, about imagining a future that's not dependent upon disaster capitalism or whatever.
Exactly
it's this
right,
lack
yeah.
of imagination for the future that also fuels nostalgia.
I think that's exactly right, because one of the things that's come out to me in the conversation, at least, is that nostalgia is not intellectual. I don't mean that it's anti-intellectual.
It's not propositional.
But exactly that. It's not propositional. And so when something is not propositional, to give a propositional response is inapt. To say that you've mischaracterized your proposition. When was America great? For whom? That's a propositional response to a non-propositional affect. But I do think we also have to look at the ways in which nostalgia is not only happening to people. And then, Lee, I think we can ask, why are you nostalgic? I think we also have to look at the nostalgia industry. People are being drawn into nostalgia by a lot of our media industry right now, a lot of our social industry. All movies are remakes, all TV shows are remakes. I wonder if that's pushing our culture to be nostalgic in ways that we might not ordinarily be.
I call this the Stranger Things empire. I think that this is what the Stranger Things series on Netflix really does.
Yeah, this is an excellent question about the nostalgia industry. I see it everywhere on my feed. And, I wonder if it's because I'm Gen X and they think that I'm like on the verge of retirement and I've got a lot of money or something. So they're trying to sell me something. All of those are false.
Yeah.
They're wasting their time on me. But I wonder if what Adorno and Horkheimer have to say about the culture industry is applicable to the nostalgia industry. Right? The culture industry for them is kind of a bourgeois conspiracy. We produce all of this entertainment, whether it be films or plays or, worst of all, jazz for Adorno, to distract us, to quell us, to shut us up and sedate us so that we're not paying attention to what's really going on around us. And it turns off our critical capacities in a lot of ways. And I wonder if the nostalgia industry is kind of doing the same thing.
Well, I think the nostalgia industry is really just an arm of the overall conservatism of our age right now. If we can make people think that life isn't as good as it used to be, then we can keep people unhappy. We can keep people sort of pining for the kinds of old days when America was great, allegedly. And, as long as that nostalgia is there, then they're looking back. They're not looking forward.
So then the question becomes whether this is an overt political program or if it's part of a cycle. And maybe here I'm being nostalgic for my youth, but I remember growing up seeing all kinds of media about possible futures. Star Trek, Star Wars, Metropolis. Not all of these futures were lovely, but they were all future-facing. But I don't see much media like that anymore. And so I wonder if that's an overt political program, the media industry has moved towards conservatism, or if it is cyclical, and if we'll go back to future orientations sometime in the future.
I mean, I think that there is a lot of future-oriented media today. I mean, it's generally apocalyptic, but it is future-oriented.
Yeah, very dystopian.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a problem in and of itself, right? Is that the only kinds of imaginative possibilities that we have about the future currently that are fed to us by the algorithm are all dystopian.
But surely we can see that these are two sides of the same coin, right? That if we have a nostalgia industry that is making us look back to a past that we lost that was good, and to the extent that we look forward at all, it's only in this dystopian, very frightening, nihilistic way, then of course we're going to favor the nostalgia over the dystopia.
Yeah. But I don't think it's an exclusively right-wing phenomenon. I mean, all my liberal and progressive friends are constantly posting, oh, remember Obama? Remember how good things were under Obama? And I myself, when I was in university, it was during the Reagan years, and I have older siblings and older cousins. And so I was nostalgic for the political movements, the political outlook of the 1960s.
Oh, yeah, there was nothing more nostalgic than the West Wing.
But then I think that puts us between a rock and a hard place, because we know nostalgia is not accurate or apt. It's this hauntology, it's this seeming of something that we know is not correct. And so we don't want to look backwards in that way because it's always going to be suspect. But then we struggle to look forward because everything is apocalyptic. And to be fair, it's hard for me to imagine a utopian future. And then I don't know where that leaves us because the present is not great either. That's why we look backwards or forwards. And so I'm wondering where we're left.
Well, let me try to recover some of the better parts of nostalgia just so that we don't end on such a terribly depressing note.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that nostalgia activates in us is a sense that somewhere there is a home for us. Somewhere there's a place where we belong. Somewhere there's a place where we're going to feel whole.
Is it over the rainbow?
I don't want to be Glinda the Good Witch here and say, just click your heels and you'll be there. But that's what keeps us moving forward. Even if moving forward seems quite dystopian or quite apocalyptic for us, that's what keeps us living. And I think that that is good, that we do need to be reminded from time to time. Actually, not from time to time. We need to be reminded frequently that this feeling of not being at home, this unhomeliness that we feel, is something that can be improved upon, right? There is a home for us somewhere.
I'm not so sure.
Well, I don't think that that has to be true, but it has to keep us going.
Okay. As a motivational thing, yes.
We have to imagine Sisyphus happy.
Okay. I set myself up for that.
You totally did. You teed that one
You
up
did,
for me
yeah.
about 10 minutes ago. Well, unfortunately, the bartender is telling us that home is not here at the bar. This is not where we belong, although we can return again and again.
And everybody does know our names.
And everyone does know our names, but ultimately we can't make the bar our home. This has been a really fantastic, even if a little bit depressing conversation. You guys, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I have learned a ton. So I really appreciate the discussion.
I didn't even get an opportunity to discuss why I think 1998 was the pinnacle of civilization. But that's another story.
All right, well, I will catch you guys next time. Thanks so much.
All right, see you later. Good night.
Good day.